Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Last week I was in Rome at this conference organized by Bank of America. The sun was shining. We were in a beautiful room, and in walks Michel Barnier, quite debonair. He wrote a book right after the Brexit negotiations talking about the secret diary of what it was like negotiating with the various UK governments. He was such a figure at the time of this towering Frenchman who would always say no to the British negotiators. So we had 20 minutes to talk about the European elections, his biggest concern. He talks about the rise of the right. He says what Brussels could do better, and we talk about Trump and if there's any way of Trump-proofing our economies. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the heart of London, this is In the City, our weekly podcast about the stories in the ears of policymakers, power brokers, financiers, and cabbies in the power centres the world over. This week, we look ahead to the European elections coming up in June and how concerned should governments and markets be about the far-right movement. I'm Francine Lacqua from Bloomberg TV, and I'm joined by opinion columnist Adrian Wooldridge. So Adrian, David Merritt is in Hong Kong. We'll hear from him when he gets back. Allegra, knee-deep in writing the readout this morning. We didn't have much to do. But you also wrote this brilliant column entitled Chief Executives Rarely Win in the Game of Geopolitics.
Yeah, I'm basically trying to say that there was a time, not that long ago, when CEOs didn't really have to think that deeply about geopolitics, when we assumed that markets would get more open, that the business of companies was to look for the best price and availability of labor. Now we live in a very different world in which geopolitics is central to all of the decisions that they're making. The most obvious example of this was Trump. When Trump came along, all the rules were torn up. But we're about to have another sort of populist explosion, which will get all the CEOs thinking again. And that is the elections in Europe in June, which I think will be another surge of populism, right-wing populism. I think the right-wing populist parties are going to do well in this election and upend a lot of conventional wisdom about how politics should work within Europe.
Why? I know you've talked about the social contract. Do people feel left behind? Is there a social contract that they were expecting that politicians are just not fulfilling?
The stagnation of living standards is a very important part of that. I think there's a general sense of nervousness about what's going on in the world, nervousness that's created by the political instability represented by Putin, but also the technological instability created by the social media and all of this extraordinary technological change that's going on. But I think there's also a sense of being left behind by the European Union, that the European Union is run by unaccountable people who are doing things that people don't necessarily approve of. And that's why this interview with Barnier is so interesting.
Well, that's a great opportunity to listen to the interview we did with Michel Barnier. He's seared into our memories from the Brexit negotiation days. Mr. Barnier, thank you so much. We have elections coming up, European elections. What's your biggest hope and your biggest worry?
To be frank, these elections are very, very important for everybody, citizens and businesses. And we are, in a sense, at the crossroad, because we are facing everywhere, except Poland, which is a good news, thanks to Donald Tusk and his team. We are facing a raising of the populism everywhere. We saw the result in UK of this populism, and we have to be very, very careful because these people are not changing. They want to break the EU from inside. It's the case of Mrs. Le Pen, Mr. Stavili in Rome, Geert Wilders in Netherlands, and even the AfD in Germany. So we have to be careful. We have to be careful to bring the right answer. This answer cannot be slogans, cannot be communication, cannot be just to wave the flag of European values. It's not enough. We have to address the direct concern on the ground for the people.
But why have we not been able to do that?
To be frank, we have to look at the work for the last 30 years. We have made mistakes. So we have to draw the lessons, in particular for the Brexit. The Brexit is remained a failure for EU and for UK. It's a lose-lose game. But we have to, on our side, it's not too late to draw the lessons. The control of the borders, a new political industrial strategy. I hope a new policy for agriculture and also less naivety in our trade exchanges.
Is the Commission now doing a good enough time to make sure that the European Union is working for everyone?
So we have to be careful and to draw, in fact, the lessons. Once again, the Commission, thanks to Jean-Claude Juncker, and for the last few years, began to draw the lessons. The populism is one thing, but the populist parties used, sometimes abused of the social anger in the ground. The reason of the Brexit is linked to the popular feeling in many regions of the UK, not against Europe, but against the fact that there's no future for the young people and no control of immigration. So we have to address concretely this issue, not confuse the populism and the popular sentiment.
But again, there is in certain cases quite a lot of confusion. Do you worry that, I guess, with the rise of the right, the hard right in certain European countries, we could see more countries leaving the EU?
I don't think so, because for many people, even in France, the Brexit negotiation had a kind of a pedagogical utility. So I think everybody saw and we can see that the Brexit solved nothing. The Brexit remains a nonsense for UK. We have to be careful, because I'm sure that Mrs. Le Pen in France, Mr. Salvini in Italy, Mr. Geert de Geert in the Netherlands, did not change their mind. They still want to destroy the EU from inside with the support of some international network from UK, Mr. Bannon, or for Russia also.
I hear a lot from insiders in Brussels that they miss the UK, having them at the table. Is there a sense actually in Brussels that it functions less well with the British counterparts?
I don't think that the Brussels management works less well, but I think that the departure of the UK is a weakness for us. As for the UK to be alone is a weakness. I think it's a lose-lose game.
You of course negotiated with the Tories, who were in charge at the time, for Brexit. We now have an election that sees the Conservatives very far behind. What does a Labour government mean for Europe?
I negotiate with the Tory government and only with the Tory government, but I met also all the other leaders, from the Liberals, for the Labour, for the local authority of Northern Ireland or Wales and Scotland, and I try to listen, to understand, listening everybody. But I negotiate, in fact, with the Tory government. I don't know what will happen. It's for the UK people to say what they want for the future government, and the door is open. I think a trade agreement we signed finally at the end of 2020 will remain the same. We can improve this agreement, for instance, on the veterinary exchanges, but it will remain the same. No cherry picking. You are out or you are in the single market. It can be both in the same time. But we can improve on other issues, the relation between UK and EU, in particular for defense issues, for external policy, for cooperation in Africa, cooperation between the services. There is many issues where we can and we must improve the relation and the common work with the UK.
What about financial services? It does seem that the Rishi Sunak government has been trying to align themselves much more with Europe.
Financial services is a part of the single market. I've been the commissioner in charge of the financial services and the financial regulations. The Brits and the city knows quite well the rules. Leaving the EU, leaving the single market, they decided themselves to lose the financial passport. And it will remain the case in the future.
But Monsieur Barnier, it seems that a lot of the jobs are going to actually New York, that it's a lose-lose situation for the City of London and also to a lot of European cities, right, on regulation.
Yes. But it is the mechanic consequences of the Brexit. And I said that exactly in the same terms at the very beginning of the negotiation in 2016, in my very first press conference. I say, nobody can underestimate the consequences of the Brexit, the financial services, economic consequences, budgetary, social. There is so many consequences, and this is one consequence.
So do you think the US is really the big winner out of Brexit in financial services?
I don't think so. the city has always a very strong relation with the city of New York and so on. So there is no surprise.
I mean, is there a way of almost Trump-proofing the economy if he becomes president?
I think we cannot expect anything good from Donald Trump. He said very clearly what he thinks about Europe. He is against the European Union. He does not understand that a stronger Europe will be a stronger ally for the US. He spoke recently about NATO in a very, very strange way for a former US president. So we have to be careful and just to know that we must be ready to do for ourselves what nobody will do at our place. We need to be ready to be independent and autonomous, even for our defense, linked in a clever way. I wish so with our NATO allies.
But what does that look like? How difficult is it to find the funds, to find the cohesion in Europe to be strong enough?
But we have made the proof, if I may say. During the Brexit negotiation, it was not evident and easy to be united, and we have been united. After the COVID crisis, and just after, we have for the very first time decided to borrow 750 billion euros to borrow together and to invest together. So we have made the proof that we can react in the right way.
But are the European elections not a test on actually the cohesion of Europe?
Yes, I think so. And I think that I hope and I will do everything I can in my country for the European parties, patriotic and European party. Never forget that we are not building a federal state. We are not building a European nation. We have, fortunately, 27 nations, 27 peoples, 24 different national languages. We need to respect the national identity of everyone, the difference of everyone. But we have to pool a large part of our policy and to act together to be respected. And our main asset, if I may, remain the single market. This is the reason why we are respected by the Chinese and the US. And we need to maintain, to preserve, and to improve the single market.
Michel Barnier, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Adrian, I'll tell you, it was a pretty interesting conversation. And when he talks about division within countries and divisions amongst countries within Europe, it also made me think of a book I'm reading from a French author that says it's a little bit, conspiracy theory, but the premise is that there are bad country actors that are permeating through our societies and trying to put a divide. And so it helps populism go on the rise because there's stuff on the dark web. It's linked to social media, but that it's actually planted on purpose by certain countries that want our democracies to fail.
I think that's absolutely true. And Putin obviously is stirring this up and it's very useful to him. But I think there are deeper structural issues here that in the United States, the reason that people voted for Trump, one of the reasons that people voted for Trump was the sense that the elites were out of touch with them, that they were pursuing an agenda that people didn't necessarily approve of, and that they were writing rules in a way that was self-serving. How many bankers, having crashed the economy, suffered serious results from that. And I think in Europe, we have a version of the same sort of thing going on. Europe has always had a sort of structural problem that it has a democratic deficit, that it was deliberately created after the Second World War, the EEC, European Union, by people who are worried about potential populism, worried about the return of Hitler. So they built all sorts of restraints on the power of the demos, on the power of the people. That is always a sort of problem. And when you put on top of that, I think two things, one of which is the broadening and the deepening. Europe intervenes in everybody's life much more than it used to. And the second is a very French-dominated notion of what sovereignty is. You have a bunch of very clever French technocrats who thrive in Brussels, and they have this notion of centralization, as opposed to the dispersal of power and of the rule of very clever technocratic elites. And I think that sets up a sort of opposition amongst ordinary people. So I think Barnier is quite an interesting example of the problem. Now, he's struggling and trying to resolve that problem, but it's a problem of democratic legitimacy that's been constantly reinforced. Now, if you look at the history of France, it's a history of centralization driven from the top, punctuated by a whole succession of populist rebellions from the French Revolution through the 1830s and 1848, 1871, the Commune and the rest of it. And I think there's a problem that we might get that in Europe, that we're setting up a sort of infernal machine of technocratic elites on the one hand, such as Mr. Barnier, and populist revolts against those elites getting ahead of the people on the other.
It's an interesting take. I think if you speak to many people on the French side, they're frustrated that it's not more technocratic. So you don't really know what the European Union is. It was conceived to be something that would stop wars because we'd be together on the defense side. It's an economic union, but actually it doesn't really have the power as one. It's kind of like a institution that sits above sovereign states. And so I feel it's kind of lost its way because we're not sure how it all fits together.
Absolutely. Now, Barnier is very interesting here, I think, because he has this sort of sense that he recognizes, on the one hand, he's saying that the British are silly. They made a complete mistake here, and the rest of Europe understands that they made a mistake, and they have therefore got rid of all of this Frexit and Italexit and the rest of it. I think that's true. On the other hand, you get a sense that he realizes that something's going wrong and that you have to have something that will keep the union together, stop it falling apart. And he emphasizes restrictions on immigration, because that is undermining popular legitimacy. And he emphasizes the importance of industrial strategy. What he doesn't talk about is democratic deficit, I think. That doesn't seem to enter it. But I think it's interesting that he's not halfway there, but he is grappling with this legitimacy problem and trying to do something about it.
Yeah, for me, it's always interesting to speak to him because actually he's still so hung up on Brexit and the fact that the negotiations, which maybe we can learn from, and I feel like the UK has moved on. We don't really talk about Brexit. It's done. We're facing, productivity concerns. We face higher inflation. There's an election coming. And Brexit doesn't really surface in the conversations that we have day to day with market participants or business leaders.
We don't talk about it openly because everybody got so sick of it. They didn't want to talk about it. And because any politician that mentions it will sort of lose their seat, On the other hand, I think it is still an underlying really, really important issue. Not least, it's because economically it's been a bad thing. And because the Labour Party, if it comes back, if it enters a customs union, if it creates a closer relationship with Europe, that would be an economic boost. So what you will get is a rewriting of the rules of Brexit without anybody talking about it.
Adrian, can I ask you, populism, it's meant, the whole premise of populism is meant to take care of the people that have the least.
Yes.
We've had populist governments.
Yes.
Here in the UK and the US. Have they achieved that at all?
No. I think, not that populism is a very old thing, and populism has had profound influence on history. For example, FDR in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, that was a sort of populism, and the idea was that you had to redistribute the wealth and power in order to prevent a breakdown of the entire system. That worked, and that was very well administered by a very well-organized and thoughtful brains trust around FDR. What happened in Britain was very interesting, that basically you had a populist movement that had quite deep roots in the country, and that was quite right in the sense that it realized that Britain was much too centralized, much too much power and wealth in London, that there was a very strong case for devolving more power and more wealth to the provinces. And that discontent led people to take this extraordinary step of leaving the European Union, a great leap in the dark, because people were so frustrated. And I think the government, I think the ruling, the political elite in general, concluded that we must do something about this. And there were all sorts of things like Theresa May talking about, creating a country that was much more at ease with itself. There were attempts to create local mayors, to devolve power and things like that. But because Brexit tore the country apart so much, we haven't really done any of that. Because the ruling class, the political elite, was so much at war with itself that it didn't really carry any of these decisions through in an intelligent way. And because Boris Johnson was such a useless administrator, they didn't do it. So the big thing about HS2 is the big model of it. HS2 was supposed to link the country up and disperse power and disperse money and make it easier to commit. We've got rid of it. We've abandoned it.
But so is this the problem that actually the poster child, right, of populism, Boris Johnson, in the US, the poster child, Donald Trump, are actually even more elitist than the elites?
They were even more elitist, but they combined elitism. I mean, they both came from the top drawer in the sense of education and wealth, and they were both useless. They were both very bad administrators. They didn't really do anything. Now I think FDR is the exact opposite of that. He was a sort of populist. Again, he came from the upper class, but he was surrounded by people, and he himself had the right temperament that he pushed through fantastic, big reforms. Now, I think an interesting person here is Joe Biden, because Joe Biden, I think, understands that the ordinary people of America are hurting, that they feel left out, that their incomes have been too stagnant, and he's pushed through big industrial strategy, big changes which are improving the living standards of the average American manual worker, manufacturing sector.
But it doesn't translate in the polls.
Not at all. No.
So it's the way that
very peculiar.
You see it in the rallies.
Absolutely.
People don't say, he's the president that's going to make my life better. And so that's a communication problem.
It's a communication problem, but also there's another thing. Apart from the economic frustration, there's a sort of culture war issue. There are a series of cultural issues that ordinary people feel left behind about, alienated about. And the more those things are at the center of politics and at the center of the chatter in London and Washington, D.C. and New York, the more people in Scranton or Rochdale or wherever feel that the country is run by people who are not like them.
Adrian, we'll probably end up discussing this more as we get into the European elections and then the UK, US elections and many more. Thanks for listening to this week's In the City. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, if you like our show, please head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts, rate, review, and subscribe. It does help people find the show. This episode was hosted by me, Francine Lacqua, with Adrian Wooldridge. It was produced by Summer Sadi, additional editing by Rishi Bujayko, and special thanks to Michel Barnier and Caroline Conan.